I remember the first raindrop that hit my skin that night. Just one cold, sharp, like it was warning me. The sky was quiet at first, just a faint rumble somewhere in the distance. My friends and I set up camp near the edge of the forest, far from any towns or trails. It was a place meant for peace, isolation, meant to make you forget the world for a while. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Now back to my story. We had come prepared, warm blankets, thick tents, enough food for days. Everything you'd need to make yourself feel safe in the wild. We laughed, shared stories as the first hints of mist settled in, and somewhere beyond the tree lean, the shadows deepened. The rain had picked up, steady, relentless, tapping against our tents like an old, familiar rhythm. It felt comforting in a way, and yet there was something in the air, something I couldn't put into words. I brushed it off at first, convinced myself it was just the quiet of the forest, the way it amplifies every little sound, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. But then there was this feeling, a sort of awareness I couldn't shake, as if someone or something had joined us just beyond the reach of the firelight, hidden in the shadows. I kept glancing back, telling myself it was just the rain, just the wind. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that we weren't alone. That was when the first real noise broke through the night, distinct and close. Just a single, deliberate snap of a branch. I froze, listening, my heart pounding against the quiet patter of the rain. I looked around at my friends, their faces reflecting the same question in my mind. Who, or what, was out there? The rain continued, heavier now, but that sound, clear, sharp, intentional, lingered in my thoughts. And just as suddenly as it had come, it faded back into silence. For a moment, I thought it might have been my imagination, the forest playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As the night wore on, the rain grew louder, the darkness thicker, wrapping itself around us like a blanket. The firelight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the trees, and every now and then, I would catch something, a glimpse, some movement, just beyond the edge of my vision. It was subtle, barely there, and yet I knew. What started as a peaceful escape into nature had become something else. Something I couldn't explain, something I wasn't prepared for. And with each passing moment, the weight of the forest pressed in closer, the rain falling heavier, the night darker. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going anywhere. And neither were we. We were 5 friends, close like family. We had planned this trip for months, waiting for the perfect weekend to disconnect from everything. Phones off, far from the city lights, far from the hum of engines and the chaos of our day-to-day lives. Just us and the forest. The place we'd chosen was remote, really remote. Miles away from any paved road, nestled at the edge of a dense forest with mountains looming in the distance. This part of the woods wasn't on any popular hiking trail. No signs, no marked paths. It was exactly the escape we wanted, a little slice of wilderness, untouched by the outside world. The rain started as a light drizzle when we set up camp, just enough to dampen the air and bring out the earthy scent of the forest floor. We laughed, shrugged it off. It added to the adventure. Our tents were pitched in a small clearing with a ring of ancient trees towering around us like silent guardians. The mist was low, clinging to the ground, swirling around our feet. It was peaceful, in a way almost surreal. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, and the constant rhythm of the rain was like a lullaby, calming us, letting us sink deeper into this quiet solitude. We sat around the fire, warming our hands, the flames casting a warm glow on our faces. There was something comforting about the rain tapping against the tents, a sound that made you feel cocooned, hidden from the rest of the world. For hours, we shared stories, each one blending into the next, laughter echoing softly under the rain-soaked trees. We spoke in hushed tones, respecting the silence of the forest around us. But the forest, it was strange. In between the stories, when one of us fell silent, there were moments when the sounds of the woods seemed to fade, swallowed by the rain. No rustling leaves, no scurrying animals, just the downpour and stillness. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, listening, watching. At first, we thought nothing of it. Just an ordinary night in the wilderness, we told ourselves. And yet, there was an odd sensation, one that settled in without warning, like an itch at the back of your mind. It felt like we had crossed an invisible line, as though we had wandered into a place that didn't want us there. We couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. The darkness felt thicker, somehow, as if it had weight pressing in around us. One of my friends, Josh, commented on how the place felt untouched, almost forgotten. It's strange, he said, his voice low. Places like this, they're so isolated. Makes you wonder what else might be out here, watching. We laughed it off, of course, just Josh trying to spook us. But his words lingered, weaving into the quiet, into the rain, into the shadows just beyond our sight. As the hours passed, the rain grew steadier, blanketing everything in a shroud of mist. Our laughter grew softer, our conversations less frequent. The air felt heavier, the kind of heavy that presses down on you, makes you think twice before speaking, before moving. Our tents were warm, safe, but as I lay there, staring up at the faint shadow of branches above, listening to the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something beyond our understanding, something that didn't welcome us. I told myself it was just nerves, the forest playing tricks on a mind unaccustomed to true silence. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to relax, trying to let the rain lull me to sleep. But deep down, I knew something was different, and as I drifted off, I could have sworn I heard it again, that faint crack, that deliberate snap of a branch. Only this time it was closer. The forest had an uncanny way of shifting as night fell, as if it were slipping into something unfamiliar. Shadows that had once seemed calm and still were now restless, moving with every flicker of the campfire, bending and stretching with an unnatural life of their own. Raindrops tapped against the tents, a constant rhythm that on its own might have been soothing. But tonight it felt like a countdown, ticking towards something we couldn't see. As we lay there in the darkness, trying to ignore the chill that had settled over us, the sounds of the forest changed. The usual chorus of nighttime creatures, the chirps, the scurries, the calls, had faded. In their place, there was only the rain, the occasional gust of wind, and something else, something deeper. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface, a low, pulsing hum that I couldn't place. I thought it was my imagination at first, but as I lay there listening, I noticed the others had grown silent too, each of us straining to hear something. Then, out of nowhere, a faint crackle broke the quiet, a twig snapping somewhere in the distance. We held our breath, waiting for the sound to come again. But there was nothing, just silence, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. After a moment, we tried to laugh it off, whispering excuses. Probably just a deer, maybe a raccoon. But each of us kept glancing over our shoulders into the depths of the trees. Minutes passed, maybe more. The firelight was dimming, casting long, weak shadows that twisted around us. And just as we were beginning to relax again, we heard it. Another crackle. This time closer, sharper, like something was moving through the underbrush. Our whispers faded, replaced by a tense, unspoken understanding. There was something out there, something watching us. I got up, cautiously, stepping away from the firelight, peering into the blackness beyond our campsite. The rain was heavier now, almost drowning out any other sounds. But as I stared into the trees, I thought I saw something, a shadow that seemed thicker, darker than the rest, hovering just at the edge of sight. My heart pounded, and I squinted, trying to make it out, but before I could be sure, it was gone like it had melted back into the night. Then Josh, who'd gone to check the area around our tents, called us over, his voice low and unsteady. He'd found something, tracks in the mud, leading around the perimeter of our campsite. The prints were odd, too large and too deep to belong to any forest animal we knew. They looked almost human, but the toes were elongated, and the depth of each step suggested a weight that didn't seem natural. We huddled around, staring at the prints in silence, a cold dread settling over us. Whatever had made them had been close, just outside our tents, circling us while we'd been oblivious in the warmth of the fire. The wind picked up, sending a chill through the trees. For a moment, it sounded like voices carried on the breeze, a faint murmur blending with the rain. It was impossible to make out any words, but the tone, it was wrong, as if it wasn't meant for us to hear. The rain grew louder, pounding now, drowning out every other sound, and we felt trapped, surrounded by darkness, with nothing but the feeble light of our dying fire. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward us, reaching out from the trees, as though they were alive. We huddled closer, our eyes darting around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, waiting. And then another snap, this time unmistakably close. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned to the others, my voice barely a whisper. Did you see something? But they were as lost as I was, each of us caught in the grip of something we couldn't explain, something that felt ancient, patient, and deeply aware of us. There was no escape from the feeling now, a sensation so strong it wrapped around us like the damp air, thickening with every passing second. The forest, the rain, the shadows, they all seemed to breathe with us, watching us in our tiny clearing, waiting for something. The night grew darker, thicker, like the rain itself was closing in on us. Our only light was the dying fire, casting faint, flickering shadows that seemed to cling to the edges of the trees, shifting every time we dared to look. We huddled close, hoping the warmth would chase away the chill that had settled over us. But nothing could shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching us from beyond the firelight. Then, just as we began to convince ourselves it was all in our heads, we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling our campsite, just beyond the line of trees. They would stop, lingering for a moment, then start up again, each step muffled by the rain, but unmistakably close. The sound was just soft enough that we couldn't be sure, but every one of us heard it. We exchanged glances, each of us hoping someone else would brush it off, dismiss it. But the fear in their eyes told me we all knew it was real. We tried to stay calm, to reason with ourselves. It had to be an animal, maybe something large like a deer. But the footsteps were too steady, too intentional. They moved slowly, deliberately, like they were sizing us up, drawing closer with each circle around the tents. Finally, Josh, the bravest among us, or maybe just the most desperate for an answer, grabbed a flashlight and aimed it into the darkness. We all watched, holding our breath, as the beam cut through the rain, casting long, wavering shadows on the trees. For a moment, there was nothing, just trees, the rain-soaked ground, and the oppressive silence of the forest. But then in the distance, just barely visible, he saw it. A figure stood there, partially hidden behind a tree. It was still too still, as though it was watching us, waiting. We couldn't make out any details, but there was something wrong with its shape, something twisted. It didn't move, didn't react to the light, just stood there motionless. Josh's hand trembled, and for a moment, I thought he might call out, but the words caught in his throat. He turned the flashlight off, and we all sat there, our hearts pounding, praying that whatever it was would just disappear. The rain grew heavier, pounding against the tents, masking every other sound. We tried to calm ourselves, to tell ourselves it was over, but the silence didn't bring relief. Instead, it brought something far worse. Whispers, faint, nearly lost in the sound of the rain, but unmistakable. They were soft at first, almost blending with the wind, like a breeze carrying voices just out of reach. We sat there, frozen, straining to make out the words, but they were faint, elusive until they weren't. Slowly, they grew louder, clearer, filling the air around us. They were calling. One of us leaned closer, listening, his face pale. Did they just say my name? I shook my head, not wanting to believe it, but I'd heard it too. My friend's name, whispered softly, like a breath, drifting through the rain. It was impossible, and yet it was there, a voice hidden in the storm, calling him, beckoning him into the darkness. We huddled closer, fear gripping us as the whispers grew louder, shifting from name to name, calling each of us in turn. The words were still indistinct, like a memory slipping just beyond reach, but there was a tone to them, a luring cadence that felt ancient and wrong. It was as if something in the forest wanted us to come closer, to leave the safety of the firelight and step into the shadows. The whispers became more urgent, almost pleading, wrapping around us like the mist, making it impossible to think clearly. I tried to block them out, to tell myself it was just the rain, but they grew louder, twisting together, blending into strange, fragmented phrases. Words I couldn't understand, words that sent a shiver down my spine, words that felt like they shouldn't be spoken. Then, suddenly, the rain stopped. Just stopped. 1 minute, we were drenched. The next, there was only silence. It was eerie wrong. We looked at each other, our faces reflecting the same dread, the same horror. And then, breaking the silence, we heard it. A voice, clear, echoing through the trees, unmistakable now. It said, "Come closer." None of us moved. We didn't speak, didn't breathe, paralyzed by the words that hung in the air. The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Low, whispering, with an edge that made my skin crawl. It was gentle, inviting. Yet beneath it, there was a darkness, a hunger. It wasn't just calling us, it was waiting for us. In the stillness, we heard footsteps again, closer this time, just outside our tents. Slow, heavy, circling us with the same patience, the same intention. One by one, the footsteps came to a stop, lingering just inches from our tents. We sat there, hearts pounding, too terrified to even look outside, each of us feeling the weight of eyes we couldn't see, the presence of something far beyond our understanding, something that didn't belong in our world. The whispers grew softer again, drifting away, but the dread remained, rooted deep in our minds, in the very air we breathed. It felt like hours passed as we waited, huddled together in silence, listening to the emptiness, to the quiet that felt more menacing than the whispers ever had. Just as we thought we might be safe, just as we dared to relax, the rain began again, harder this time, drowning out every sound. And as it fell, I thought I heard one last whisper, faint, almost lost in the storm, but undeniably there. "We'll be waiting." We sat there, trapped by the whispers and the darkness pressing in on us, and we knew we couldn't stay any longer. The safety of the tent was an illusion now, offering no protection from the strange presence surrounding us. One by one, we grabbed our flashlights, our hands shaking, our breath shallow. We had to know what was out there. We had to see it, whatever it was. So, slowly, we unzipped the tent and stepped out into the storm. The rain was unrelenting, pounding down in sheets, turning the ground into a thick, sticky mud that clung to our boots with every step. The forest was darker than before, the trees looming above us like twisted shadows, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the forest itself was alive and waiting. We moved cautiously, sweeping our flashlights through the trees, casting fleeting beams of light across the drenched undergrowth. Every shadow seemed to pulse and shift, moving just at the edge of our vision, slipping away as soon as we tried to focus on it. The rain and wind masked any sounds, making it feel as though we were alone in a vast, empty void. But we knew better. We could feel it, eyes on us, watching from every direction. Then, after what felt like hours of searching, we stumbled into a clearing. It was small and open, as if someone had purposely cut it out of the dense forest. And there, in the center of the clearing, was something that made our blood run cold. An altar, a crude, makeshift altar, formed from mud and stones, with strange symbols etched into the earth around it. They weren't symbols any of us recognized, twisting shapes that seemed to writhe and shift in the shadows, as if they were alive. The rain had turned the symbols into muddy scars on the ground, but they held a dark energy, an unnatural pull that seemed to radiate outward, drawing us closer despite our terror. One of us muttered, What is this?" But there was no answer, only the rain and the oppressive silence of the clearing. My eyes were fixed on the altar, on the small, strange trinkets scattered around it. Bones, pieces of cloth, a broken doll that looked like it had been there for decades. And, worst of all, what looked like fresh animal remains, laid out carefully as if part of a ritual. Just then we heard it, a crack, loud and sharp, slicing through the storm. We spun around, our flashlights darting wildly, searching for the source of the sound. And then we saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was barely visible, obscured by the rain and shadows, but we could make out the shape of a person. They were tall, unnaturally so, their limbs long and thin, their face hidden in darkness. With every flash of lightning, their silhouette seemed to shift, contorting, twisting into something that defied logic. We stood there, paralyzed, as the figure watched us, unmoving. The rain was deafening now, drowning out everything but the pounding of our hearts. Yet somehow, I could swear I heard a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. Someone whispered, "We need to go now." But when we tried to move, our feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the forest itself was holding us in place. The figure remained motionless, watching, waiting, its head tilting ever so slightly, as though amused by our fear. Then another crack, a branch breaking underfoot, a step closer. That was all we needed. We turned and ran, stumbling through the mud, slipping and sliding as we scrambled to get away from the clearing, from the altar, from the figure that seemed to linger at the edge of our vision no matter how fast we ran. But the forest had changed. The familiar path back to our campsite was gone, replaced by twisted trees and thick underbrush that seemed to close in around us, leading us in circles. The rain turned to a torrential downpour, blinding us, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The thunder roared, rattling our bones, and with every flash of lightning, we caught glimpses of that same figure, just beyond the trees, watching, following. Our breaths came in ragged gasps, our hearts racing as we pushed through the endless forest. The whispers were louder now, clearer, each one seeming to come from a different direction, wrapping around us like tendrils of smoke. And the words, we could finally understand them, though I wish we hadn't. They were calling us, each of us by name, their voices dripping with a sickening familiarity, as if they'd known us all our lives, as if they'd been waiting for this very moment. We shouted to each other, desperate, pleading for anyone to know the way back, but our voices were swallowed by the storm. The rain poured down harder, turning the ground to sludge, our footsteps sinking deeper with every step. I felt like I was being pulled under, like the very earth was trying to swallow me whole. Just when I thought we were lost, I saw a glimmer of light through the trees, the faint glow of our campfire, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Relief washed over me, and I yelled to the others, pointing toward it. We stumbled forward, our legs heavy, our clothes drenched, our minds numb with fear. But as we drew closer, something changed. The light flickered, dimmed, and for a moment, it looked like it wasn't our fire at all. It was something else, a faint, pulsing glow that didn't belong in the natural world. But by then, we were too desperate to care. We pushed forward, breaking through the trees and collapsing onto the ground by the fire. We sat there, gasping, trying to catch our breath, our minds reeling from what we'd seen, what we'd heard. The rain eased slightly, and for the first time, the forest was silent again. But in that silence, I felt something shift, something settle, as if the forest had gotten what it wanted and it was done with us. Then, just as we began to feel the faintest relief, we heard it. Soft, faint, almost lost in the dying rain. Footsteps. We finally made it back to what we thought was our tent, collapsing in a heap, shivering, drenched to the bone. The weight of exhaustion pulled us down, every muscle aching, our hearts still pounding from the terror we had just escaped. The rain was finally easing, softening to a gentle patter, and we zipped up the tent, sealing ourselves in, desperate for the illusion of safety, if only for a few hours. But the moment we sat down inside, something felt wrong. It was our tent, yet it wasn't. Every detail was just slightly off, the sleeping bags arranged in a way none of us had left them, the faint scent of something earthy and unfamiliar clinging to the fabric. The flashlight we left by the entrance was missing, replaced by an old, rusted lantern that cast an unnatural, flickering glow across our faces. We huddled in silence, each of us haunted by our own thoughts, by the memory of the figure lurking in the trees, the strange altar in the clearing, and the whispers that seemed to know our deepest fears. We tried to convince ourselves it was just exhaustion playing tricks on us, that our minds were fogged by fear and the remnants of the storm. But deep down, none of us could shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, that we had ventured somewhere we weren't meant to go. As dawn broke, pale light filtered through the tent's thin fabric, and we finally dared to step outside. The forest was calm now, washed clean by the rain, bathed in a soft, golden glow. For a brief, foolish moment, I almost believed we were safe, that the nightmare had passed with the storm. Then I turned around and felt the ground shift beneath me. Our true campsite lay just a few yards away, untouched and pristine, exactly as we left it when we first arrived. Our tent sat there, closed and undisturbed, the campfire stones still in a perfect circle, our bags neatly placed by its side. It was as though we had never camped there at all. We stared at each other in confusion, dread settling over us like a shroud. Everything we'd experienced, every frantic step we'd taken through the rain-drenched forest, it had all led us back to this spot, yet it was as if we'd never been there. And then we noticed them, footprints, shallow but clear, leading from our untouched tent to the clearing. They were unmistakable, pressed into the soft mud and winding through the trees, marking the exact path we had taken the night before. They led to the altar, the place where we'd seen the strange symbols and the twisted remnants of the ritual. But now, the clearing was empty, silent. The altar was gone, not a trace of it left in the mud, as though it had never been there. All we found was a single, damp piece of cloth lying where the altar once stood, half buried in the mud, stained and fraying at the edges. It looked old, far older than anything we'd brought with us, as if it had been left there long before we'd ever set foot in these woods. As we packed up, our hands shaking, our voices low, none of us could shake the feeling that we'd been touched by something beyond our understanding, something that didn't belong in this world. Even now, as I tell you this, I can feel it, the memory lingering like a shadow in the back of my mind, whispering, waiting. Because no matter how far we run, no matter where we go, I know that figure will always be there, just on the edge of the shadows, watching, waiting for the next storm. Now, as you listen to the last drops of rain fading into the night, ask yourself, could you spend a night alone in the forest, knowing something might be watching? Could you feel the weight of every shadow, the silence pressing in, knowing that just beyond your sight, something is waiting? Or, if it were you, would you have dared to follow those footsteps into the unknown? Tell us, what would you have done in their place? And if you're drawn to the mysteries hidden in the darkness, the shadows that linger beyond a campfire light, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Until next time, keep an eye on the shadows.